Stanislavski said that everything that happens in life was expected to be different. Therefore, the same should be on stage.
Hello and welcome back to the Spiritual Psychology of Acting podcast. This is episode 10. It's the final episode in this current series of the podcast. But don't worry, we will be back later this summer for a second season. We've already started planning for it and there are some really exciting episodes to come. But this week, we are delving into the world of human zoology. It's a term popularised through the work of Desmond Morris, who, in a series of very popular books in the 60s and 70s, offered a unique perspective on human behaviour, emphasising our biological nature and the similarities found in the animal kingdom. After a brief overview, we explore how the understanding of human behaviour through the lens of human zoology can enhance the craft of acting, bringing a greater sense of authenticity and depth to our characters. So, without further ado, here's our conversation. So this episode is going to focus on human zoology, as outlined by Desmond Morris in his 1967 book, The Naked Ape. And that was obviously very formative for you, wasn't it, in the creation of the spiritual psychology of acting? That kind of informs a lot of the tenets, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously in developing the course, I was very interested in psychology, the science of mind and behavior, but that led to some sort of deeper questions about where does these certain purposes, certain drives that human beings have, what are their origins and why do we have them, and what's natural in a human being and what's unnatural. I mean, my teacher, Sam Kogan, he was very anti certain purposes that human beings had, like the purpose I want to belong, and the purpose I want to be admired, and the purpose I want to be superior. And that's something we want to touch on later. And I wanted to understand, well, if people have these purposes, surely that they must be part of the makeup. I mean, not that, they could become very unuseful, but surely they're part of the makeup of a human being, and there must be some biological evolutionary need for those purposes. So that's where I came across the book, The Naked Ape. In fact, it's a trilogy. It's The Naked Ape, The Human Zoo is the second book, and then the third is called Intimate Behavior. And in the book, Desmond Morris really, he's a zoologist, and he'd spent his time studying, first of all, fish, and then I think he went on to sort of reptiles, and then onto mammals, and then finally he spent a lot of his career studying chimpanzees. And it seemed like he was going through the cycle of evolution in his studies until he finally came to the human, what he calls the naked ape, the human animal. And just I found that looking at the perspective of a human being from the point of view, not just of psychology, but from the point of view of zoology, really added something to the spiritual psychology of acting course, or at least my understanding of human behavior and human drives.
It's amazing, isn't it? Because the book is obviously over 50 years old, but a lot of it still really holds up today. Like, it's kind of, Desmond Morris predicted a lot of things and saw a lot of similarities, which at the time were probably very revolutionary ideas, which we just now take for granted. But yeah, I guess to start then, the very beginning is a very good place to start, isn't it? So, like, for the origins of the human race, then what does Desmond Morris have to say about how we began as human beings?
Well, he says that we evolved from primates, which seems to be pretty common sense, even though there is a gap from about 4 to 7 billion years ago. There's a kind of break in the fossil record where we don't really know what happened there. We seem to go into that period as more like apes. We've got a common ancestor with the chimpanzee around 15 million years ago, and we seem to have come out of that period as what he calls a naked ape. But there's missing pieces in the fossil record to understand that. So in the book, a lot of it is just in his, as a zoologist, his intelligent conjecture about what he thinks has happened. And of course, it's very difficult to prove because, we don't have a time machine. We can't go back to those times and see what was happening. He's just piecing together the bits of the puzzle I think, in a very intelligent way. There seems to be, Darwin talked about natural selection as being the way that things evolved. But there's something that came to my mind, which is a term, physis. And physis is the energy that I came through this through, looking into psychiatry and looking into psychology. But there's one term, which is physis. And physis is the energy that wants to grow and improve. And I think this is partly the engine of evolution. There seems to be an energy running through. Why do creatures evolve into other forms? And what is the energy, which is really consciousness, seems to have some kind of destination. It seems to be moving towards something. As we go from sort of, the singularity of just pure consciousness through all the different species, they become more and more diverse and they become more and more novel. And by all accounts, they become more and more intelligent. The human brain is the most sophisticated organic computer in the universe, and that's happened over a very sort of long period of time. But I sometimes listen to Dr. Brian Cox, and I remember seeing Dr. Brian Cox in one of the programs, and he was standing there on a mountain top, and there was all the stars around him. Like one of those sort of sequences that the BBC do so well. And he said, and it's amazing to think that all of this is here by pure accident. And I just thought, pure accident, my arse. There certainly seems to be some order to it. And there certainly seems to be some driving force behind the evolution. But from a biological evolutionist point of view, the origin of the human being going into the ape, going into the human form that we see today, it all seems to have come from a change of diet and a change in how we feed and how we eat. Our ancestors lived, as apes, lived in the trees, and they were herbivorous, and they would spend most of their day just plucking fruit and eating the fruit, which is low sort of calorie food. It's not energy is intense. And then at some point, and no one knows quite what the reason was, perhaps it was climate. Perhaps it was a desire to explore beyond the forest, but we went out onto the plains, and that seems to have been the big movement, because we went from eating a herbivorous diet to starting to include meat, which had a lot more energy. There'd be a lot more calories. It was a lot richer food. And Desmond Morris claims that that's really how we began to evolve into the human beings that we find today, because we had to hunt. And we weren't equipped like the other carnivorous animals, like lions and tigers and leopards and wolves and hyenas, etc. They had all evolved to eat meat, and we hadn't. We'd come from a sort of a herbivore stock. And so in order for us to do that, we had to evolve. We couldn't evolve the strong jaws or the sharp claws, but what we did evolve was the brain. And for us to hunt, it required cooperation, and it required mutual assistance. where I think, a lot of the origin of the purpose I want to belong and the need for human beings to be a part of each other comes from this needing to work as a team in order to survive. So, if we were out on a hunt, we had to say, okay, right, so you hide behind that rock there with your spear, which we'd had to create the intelligence in order to create a spear, a weapon, a tool. Then we're going to chase the gazelle, and then you hide behind the rock. And when it goes past, you're going to stick it, okay? You're going to stab it. And then we're going to make a kill, and then we're going to eat. And for us to do that, we had to develop language, and we had to cooperate, and we had to bond. And the other thing that we had to do was we had to stand upright in order to do that. So we had to be able to bear weapons, and we had to be able to bear tools. And by standing upright, we freed our hands. So rather than going around like as a four-legged creature, we became bipedal, and we stood up. And that made a huge change. It freed up our hands to become much more sophisticated of what we could do with our hands. So we had to develop a better brain. And in order to develop a better brain, we had to have a longer childhood. A human infant, when a human infant is born, they're pretty well helpless. They're completely helpless. Yeah. As opposed to, other creatures, they come out and they're already pretty well formed. I was watching a David Attenborough about a chameleon. It was a form of chameleon. It's a reptile. And this reptile literally comes out of the egg. And it literally, when it comes out and it has to run across the sand. And it had all these razor snakes that are lying in waiting to eat it. It was a good chance for the razor snakes to have a good meal. Yeah. And it had the intelligence already and the ability to run. This young, new, just hatched chameleon. I think it was a chameleon, and it could run, and it could do all these things, and it was aware of all these responses. Whereas a human baby is pretty well helpless, and it needs a longer infancy period. And for it to have a longer infancy period, it needed to have a family unit. It needed to have the mother and the father looking after it. So in order for it to have a family unit, we had to develop something which is unique amongst the primates, which is a pair bonding mechanism. So we would go into partnerships, a male and female partnership, and create a family unit in order to bring up this offspring that needed a longer period of infancy. And so that evolved us, as Desmond Morris says, that the human animal is the sexiest primate, is the sexiest animal. The human male has the biggest penis of all the primates. The shape of the body. He talks about how he thinks that breasts evolved because, in the other primates, the breasts are there for milk, and they literally just work as, two milk sacs, and they fill up with milk, and then the infant feeds from that. But in the human animal, the breasts have this different kind of shape. They're more rounded. They protrude more. And he says that the breasts essentially evolved in the human female as what he calls pseudo buttocks. So they replicate the shape of the bottom, which, looking at the bottom, it's if you look at a woman's bottom, it's a sexual signal. I mean, there are many. The other thing we should say is there are many exceptions to this. What we're dealing with here is just the general. Of course, there are male-to-male pair bonds, and these occur in nature. I'm told that in the New York Zoo, 10% of the penguins there form male to male pair bonds. So this is all part of the picture as well. But for these intents and purposes, we're just looking at sort of the general.
Well, I think it's all about survival, isn't it? The pair bond mechanism is there to survive and to continue, but that pair bond mechanism has evolved and developed, and so that still exists. We still have that sense and desire to be with another human being in a romantic sense, but it's not always necessarily for just copulating to produce offspring.
Right.
I guess is the
But
key.
you have to keep the pair interested in each other. And the
Right, yeah.
mechanism that nature's used to do that is sex.
And that's why he says the breast, right? Because we became bipedal and on two legs, and we're now facing each other rather than taking from behind. That's why we have to have the sense of we have sexual signals on the fronts of our bodies rather than the behind, right?
Yeah, well, to keep the human primate interested through the sexual signals, those things have evolved. He also talks about the lips. He calls that. Why are the lips the shape they are, and why are they the color that they are? Is really a replication of the labia. He calls the lips pseudolabia. Women wear lipstick and they make them more red, which is more the appearance of the labia when there's arousal. Why is there blusher? Because of the sexual response of the blushing that takes place with the sexual response. So he says that the human being had to become a very sexy animal in order to maintain that pair bond. It's also, he claims, that's one of the reasons why we've become the naked ape, is because we've got this naked skin, and really the whole of the skin has become one big erogenous zone for the purpose of, for tactile purposes, for the purposes of touch, in intimacy. And in the human copulation sequence, there's a lot more touching and there's a lot more physical intimacy before copulation.
Yeah, a lot of preparation, which you don't find in the other animals in the animal kingdom. We have far more build-up, don't we, to the actual act of copulation.
There's far more build-up, yeah, and it's to create more and more bonding.
That's also interesting what he talks about, the erogenous zones, like how we evolved earlobes because they're such an erogenous zone. There seems to be no other function or reason why we have them. Or even the sense of, our noses don't need to be this big. Again, it's another erogenous zone, right, that we've developed for that purpose.
Oh, exactly. The earlobes, if you look through a thermal camera of people having sex, the earlobes become, you'd see very red in that area. Right. So the earlobes become aroused, as do the sides of the nose, which is obviously the point when people kiss. The sides of the nose touch each other.
Yeah.
There's an interesting thing. I'm not sure if I got it in Desmond Morris, but why human kissing, open mouth kissing. And there's one theory that it goes further back than apes to something in our past with dogs. That when a dog, when you come home, the dog wants to lick your mouth. And the reason why the dog wants to lick your mouth is because it was a feeding thing. So because in nature, the wolf would make a kill, and then there would be around the mouth, there would be food, and the dog would put its tongue in its parent's mouth.
Right. Yeah.
I just find all of this so fascinating, what the origins of these, behaviors are.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was the next thing. We had to stand up. We had to have a longer childhood. We had to stand up. And the pair bond had to remain faithful, which he says obviously hasn't been perfected. The pair bond mechanism in human beings haven't been perfected in the same way that it has in, say, albatross, who I think the albatross, when they pick a partner, they breed with the same partner for life. But in the human being, we get, straying eyes. And that's interesting because I think, as the point you made when we were talking earlier on about this, why one thing with actors of why acting and films are so
Yeah.
important.
It's to do with the sexual curiosity, right? That we've developed lots of different positions to keep us interested so that the pair bond mechanism survives. And so we keep surviving as a species, that we keep sex interesting rather than just purely functional. And let's say that, like you're saying there, with it's not being perfected, that sexual curiosity also threatens the pair bond mechanism. And so that we find a less harmful substitute through voyeurism. And essentially that is what acting is, that we all indulge in this behavior. Almost all of us do, in terms of reading magazines or stories or watching movies, especially like rom-coms, that they are basically a version of the pair bond mechanism in the safety of our own homes, that we don't have to go out and find it elsewhere.
Well, exactly. I mean, in the love story, in studying screenwriting, one of the things I studied was the love story genre, and the beats of that. The sections of it move through. They actually replicates the human pair bonding mechanism. Which starts with a look, and then a conversation, and then there'll be some touching. And then there'll be some, holding hands and sort of public display. And then there'll be more physical touching. And then the touching goes further south. And then it goes, we know from there, really, it goes all the way to copulation. It follows that. And the stages of a love story follow that. And when the audience get to watch that, they're going through, as it were, in active imagination, the stages of the pair bonding mechanism. And they're getting to live it out through watching a film rather than, going off and having an affair. And that doesn't mean that people don't go off and have an affair. I mean, the divorce rates show us that the pair bonding mechanism hasn't been completed in the human being.
And that's interesting, though, isn't it? Because it's all about active imagination, right? Isn't it? That's essentially like that. It exists in the form of romantic comedies and all that kind of stuff. But that whole living vicariously by proxy through another human experience is basically what all acting is, right? You could say the same for horror films, that people get that thrill of it because they're exercising their own fears. They're getting to live out and experience these things in an incredibly safe and controlled environment. The same with any kind of drama, right? It's you get to see these characters live tragic lives so you can learn how to do it better in your own way.
Well, there's a high, from the horror film, there's a high, isn't there? Because of the fear that releases the adrenaline, and the people are getting high on the adrenaline. They're feeling more alive through watching a horror film because it's something scary. But it also that doing it by proxy, that works in sport as well. I mean, what is a football match if it isn't really a group hunt? And rather than putting the spear into the bison, they're putting the ball in the back of the net. And so what you've got in a football match, in a football stadium, is, you've got these 11 men on each side really going hunting. It's the hunting instinct that they're playing out. And then what have you got with the, 50,000 fans watching it? They're all fulfilling that basic drive to go and hunt by proxy through active imagination of watching the football players playing football.
I think Desmond Morris also says that there's the whole side of sports, I guess, which nowadays is very lucrative and you can get incredibly famous, and there's all that kind of the glitz and glamour associated with it. But there's a reason why so many people around the world are engrossed in sport, and it's because of those primal dynamics, isn't it? It's like you say, the hunt. It's teamwork. So there's people, obviously. There are Cristiano Ronaldos who go for glory and go for all that, but the whole point of football, isn't it? It's a team bonding based exercise, and it only works. You only get the kill, score the goal if you work as a team.
Exactly, but we don't have to hunt. We just go to the supermarket now, and we just buy the food in the supermarket. There's no hunting for. I mean, you could say that even going to the shops is like going on a hunting expedition and coming back. But we don't fulfill it to the same degree. So in our biology, we find other ways to fulfill it. through sports and through the arts.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the story, really. That's sort of an overview of how did we arrive? I mean, very, very brief, but how did we arrive at where we are as a human species? It's only, a million years ago since we learned to use a first sort of flint knife. And we should bear in mind that 98% of our genes are the same as a chimpanzee. Our biological genetics.
That's the problem of living, isn't it? Because we essentially are still we've not evolved that much over the past couple of 100,000 years, and yet our technological advancements and our culture and stuff has risen and grown so quickly that our brains are finding it very hard to keep up with, especially when it comes to like technology, right? It's a bit of a problem of living, isn't it? How do we marry these two, our very old and ancient brains and bodies, with all this incredibly complex new technology?
Well, there's obviously been a massive change in the last 10,000 years, because it's over the last 10,000 years where we've started agriculture.
Right,
and
yeah.
in agriculture, we don't have to go out and hunt. We've just bred the animals, and the animals are there for the food source.
And also, nest building is basically now architecture, isn't it? That's where we've
Well, exactly. It's the same origin. But what's that done? That's freed up time.
Yeah.
And then the mind has been able to explore other things. And that's really where culture has come in, really, since the advent of agriculture.
He calls that the stimulus struggle, doesn't he, Desmond Morris? We have to figure out ways in which to entertain ourselves. So it is a distraction of some degree, but it's incredibly important for our survival as well, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Well, we're left with the problem of, how to pass the time between the cradle and the grave.
Yeah.
It's interesting. In Eric Burns' book, The Games People Play, he says at the end of that book, if you have read my book, and of course the games he's talking about there are the games of transaction analysis. And what he means by a game is a set of transactions which are a covert operation. In other words, there is a set of transactions that lead to a different aim than the one that is being expressed. So it's a game. And what is it, a game? It's a game that the purpose of it is to siphon off libido energy and mortido energy. So that's, the function of a game is to siphon off libido and mortido tensions. And he says at the end of the book that if you've read my book and you think I've reduced much of human experience to playing games in order to pass the time between the cradle and the grave, then you've understood my book.
Genius.
But then, I should add to that by what he says after that, which I find really interesting. And remember, this isn't a spiritual guy. This is a psychiatrist speaking. He said that, however, there are three things which are beyond the game playing in human experience, as far as he was concerned. And he said the first is awareness. So we can develop awareness, we can see more, we can understand more, we can understand ourselves. That's Homo sapien, means thinking ape, essentially. Secondarily, he says, is spontaneity, is the quality of spontaneity. Freedom to act, freedom to make choices, rather than just being stuck in these habitual games that people play in order to relieve their libido and mortido tensions. And thirdly, intimacy, true intimacy, where people really share without using devices, where they really share who they are and what their experience is, which, of course, nourishes the pair bonding mechanism. Of course, and creates proper community and friendship. Your friend is someone that you share with, you discover the truth with. And he says they're the three things that go beyond just the playing of games. Hello, everybody. I hope very much that you've been enjoying our podcast on the spiritual psychology of acting. We've certainly enjoyed exploring all the topics in this season, and we're currently looking at the second season where we've got some more amazing guests and planning some fantastic topics to explore. But I wanted to share with you some exciting news, and that's that I'm going to be offering some live in-person workshops, an opportunity to get in the room with me and learn how to act properly. The first one is a 2-day introductory weekend. That takes place on the 15th and 16th of July. And then most exciting of all, we're now offering a 2-week intensive summer school. That starts on the 31st of July and runs until the 11th of August. That's Monday to Friday. In the first week, we're going to be looking at the elements of great acting and looking at all the practical exercises and technique exercises related to the elements, as well as all the detailed theory. And then in the second week, we're going to be going through the 10 steps to creating a character. That's where we learn to take the elements of acting and apply them to a script in any style, in any genre, for film, television, or plays. And in the meantime, I'm going to be offering 2 online intro seminars with a general introduction to the spiritual psychology of acting. And they take place on Tuesday, the 20th of June, and on Wednesday, the 5th of July, from 6:30 till 9 p.m. British summertime. And all that remains for me to say is I wish you a very happy summer, and I hope to see you at one of our workshops. Lots of love. So, the other thing that I wanted to talk about here with all this that's useful in acting is in zoology, there's what we call displacement activities. And I think this comes into doing really good acting. I think that I teach my actors to have some understanding of how this works in biology. So if you have, for example, if you've ever fed the pigeons, and you've got a sandwich or something and the pigeons cluster around you and you start breaking off bits of your sandwich and sharing it with the pigeons, they'll go for the bit of sandwich. But pigeons have a very distinct hierarchy, as do humans create hierarchy as well. Hence the purpose, I want to be superior, or I want to be powerful. These are sort of hierarchical drives. But the pigeons have a very clear hierarchy. And if a superior pigeon and an inferior pigeon both go for the piece of bread, the inferior pigeon must have a picture in its head of eating that tasty crumb. What propels it to open its beak and lurch its neck forward. It must have a picture in its head of eating that particular crumb. And it goes to do it, but then that impulse is thwarted by a superior pigeon who's higher up in the hierarchy. And then what happens to the energy that's been created of the purpose to eat the crumb meeting an obstacle, which is the superior pigeon? That creates a tension. And then what does the pigeon do? You may have seen them. They'll walk round in a circle and they'll flap their wings. And what they're doing is releasing the tension of the purpose meeting an obstacle. And this we find in the drama all the time. And in making sort of detailed acting and detailed behavior, that you have a purpose, and then you go for the purpose as a character. As an actor, you might know that the character's never going to fulfill their purpose, right? Because you read the play. But the character goes for the purpose, meets an obstacle, and then that creates a tension. So you have this creation of tension and then release. And in good acting, there's a moment of tension, And how do you do it as an actor? We call this creating basic events. There are two perspectives. There's the perspective of the actor and the perspective of the character, meaning a view of the future, right? So when you're standing in the wings about to go on stage, or you're standing there on set ready for the director to say action, there are two perspectives. One is the perspective of the actor, which is made up of the events of the play. So now I do this, then I do that, then I do that, or now I walk on stage and then I look around to orientate myself, as the director asked me to do. Then I notice there's a chair. And then I decide to go and sit on the chair. I sit on the chair and I wait for a few moments. And then I notice an apple. And I look around and decide whether I'm going to do, and I can see there's no one looking. So I pick up the apple and I take a bite. Right? So that would be the actor's perspective, the events of the play. And so the character's perspective is made up of the character's purposes, the character's desires. So I want this, but I get this. Stanislavski said that everything that happens in life was expected to be different. Therefore, the same should be on stage. So how do you do it? So with that example of coming into the room, is you have a picture in your head of what you imagine the room to look like. So then when you open the door and you walk into the room, if you're walking into that room for the first time, you have a natural orientation where your brain goes from what you're expecting to see and what is really there. And then you look around and you see the seat and you make a decision to go and sit on the seat. And then you go over to the seat, and we even have a picture before we sit down of how it's going to feel. These are we call short-term purposes. They come as little flashes. And they're so quick, and unless we develop the awareness, we can't see them. But you can develop the awareness to see these little flashes of short-term purposes. And so when you sit down, the chair is either harder, softer, spongier than you imagined it to be, so that it's different than you thought. And then you look around and you see the apple sitting there in the fruit bowl, and you have the purpose, I want to eat that nice, fleshy, juicy apple. And then you have the purpose and you go to pick it up, you put it by your mouth, and then you hear the door open with the other character coming in, and you quickly put it back. How do you act that authentically? You have to have the purpose that you want to eat that bite of the apple. And as an actor, you know that you're never going to eat it because the other character is going to disturb you. But it will only look real and authentic if you have a purpose, I want to take the bite of the apple. Do you see what I mean? This is working in detail. This is the final level of understanding the 10 steps to creating a character. We call these programming basic events. These are the moment to moment. This is the real icing on the cake. This is where we start going into detail. This is where the audience are like, wow, how is it? I don't know why, but it just looks completely real. It's because you've programmed it, and you don't have to do it for every single moment. You have to do it for the most important moments.
Yeah. I find that with actors, like acting anger, especially, how it can often just look so forced and so kind of cliched is because they're just kind of going through the motions of what they think anger looks like. But really, it's like, and Desmond Morris talks about this in the whole chapter about fighting in The Naked Ape, about whenever a threat comes up, there's so many physiological changes in our body that gets us ready to attack and be aggressive and to hopefully stave off so there's no actual attacking needed. But then when that threat level goes, our physiological senses kind of return to a base kind of normality level again. And so it's like this kind of stuff is, human zoology is so important, I think, because you find out all these physiological changes that your body goes through for all these different sensations. And that's, it comes from the cause and effect thing, right? You're not just angry out of nowhere for no reason. You're angry because something's frustrating your purposes, right? And that's what you've got to realize, that the anger is coming from somewhere rather than just being angry. And it's the same for every other emotion that comes up, right? You're not forcing any emotion. You're not trying for anything. You're finding out what makes the character angry, what makes the character sad.
Well, taking that example is a really good example of anger, of acting anger, is that really what is anger? Anger is attacking obstacles to purposes.
Mm.
So what's the first precondition of creating the character's anger is you have to have a purpose. You have to want something. You have to desire something. Say, for example, you wanted to get into the nightclub. The scene is you want to get into the nightclub because someone's phoned you and said that your girlfriend is in the nightclub being chatted up by another guy and they're starting to get smoochy. And you want to get into the nightclub and you want to go and separate them, right? Because it's a breach of the pair bonding mechanism, if we're going to sort of get zoological about it. And you arrive at the nightclub and they say, you can't come in, you're way too casual, you're wearing trainers. Only if you have a purpose to get in there and put that other guy right and get between him and your partner will you actually have the anger in the scene towards the bouncer who's stopping you getting in. It's only if you have a purpose. If you don't have a purpose, you have then, as an actor, what you do, you show. Negative emotions are the result of obstacles to purposes. All negative emotion is watching obstacles to purposes. So the first precondition of creating the character's negative emotion, be it sadness, be it anger, or whatever, is having a purpose. And a purpose, you need to have it in pictures and impressions, and you have to want it. And so that's what the character's perspective is made of. It's made of the desires, and the skill is, as an actor, is desiring something where you've read the play and you know you're not going to achieve it, or you've been to the rehearsal, you're not going to achieve it, but still wanting it. And then that creates the natural moments of disorientation. And the disorientation comes, and it's the shortfall between the expectation and the result. That's where acting becomes really mechanical. It just turns into just actor's perspective. My line, your line. We've all seen it. That kind of acting. Or sometimes you'll see a play. You'll read good reviews of a play. I remember there was a play at a national some years ago that I'd read reviews of, and it sounded really good. So I went along to see it, and the acting was really hollow. They were all just going through the motions, and you could really feel it. And you think that review was written 2 months ago, when actually the characters, it was all fresh to the actors, and now it's become stale through repetition, and all you're left with is the actor's perspective. And that's what makes it boring. And part of the skill of a professional actor is to stick with the character's perspective every night, to want what the character wants. I mean, there's no Macbeth if every night when you go on and you're playing Macbeth, you have to have a purpose that you, or at least an objective, that you want to be the King of Scotland.
Yeah.
If you don't go on with the objective, I want to be the King of Scotland, there's no play.
I remember hearing a story about a rehearsal where they were doing Macbeth, and what Macbeth and Lady Macbeth want is incredibly powerful, and it's vital to them. It's everything. And they said the rehearsal was just so dull, and it was just flat. And then somebody from across the room dropped a glass and it smashed, and all of a sudden everyone was full of life. And it was in that moment there was just so much more life in that than there was in the last hour of rehearsal before that, where it was just monotonous, going through the motions, saying the lines, doing actions without anything psychologically attached to it. You've got to make it real, haven't you?
Well, that's how you do it. You have to expect something that's going to be there. But of course, actors aren't taught this. They're not taught how to do this properly. And that's, on the course, this is the bulk of the training, is understanding these techniques of how to make it. How does it, your job is to make it look spontaneous every night. And this is how you do it. I mean, obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, and we need practical exercises. I sometimes wonder if people listening to this podcast think that it's enough to just hear the podcast. which is really akin to just going into a restaurant and reading the menu. You don't want to read the menu. You want to actually eat the food, and that you need to do the practice. You need to do the course to actually do the practical exercises to assimilate the information that we're giving in the podcast.
Yeah.
Well, let's sort of wrap up then, just by saying that, the study of human zoology and zoology in general has been extremely valuable in understanding human behavior to replicate it for the stage and screen. And it's a really vital part of the spiritual psychology of acting is understanding some of these principles and how they work. But I feel like we've only really just scratched the surface of what's here. I know that we had a lot of other topics that we were planning to discuss today, but the podcast would go on for hours. So maybe what
I think it merits a part two.
Yeah, I think in the next season we should do a second Human Zoology and the Actor Part 2.
Yeah, definitely.
And we should dive into some of the other principles that are very useful, that have become such a great part of the course.
You've been listening to the Spiritual Psychology of Acting podcast. Thank you so much to everyone who has listened to the podcast this season. If you'd like to help support us, you can do so by leaving us a 5-star review on iTunes and sharing the podcast with your family and friends. It all makes a massive difference. During the break, please get in touch with us via the email address podcast@spiritualpsychologyofacting.com. We'd love to hear any feedback, questions you might have, or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes. We'll be releasing a trailer for the second series of the podcast a week or two before we begin the next batch of episodes, which will contain a teaser of some of our special guests and excerpts of episodes to come. But until then, have a wonderful summer, be kind to each other, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you to Charlie Robinson, she helps with the video editing and artwork for this podcast, and to Omid 16B for providing the music. The track is called Love and is available on all streaming platforms.